Welcome to The Faithful Steward. This is a podcast all about sharing biblical wisdom and practical insights in order to help church leaders pursue and teach financial freedom as part of Christian discipleship. We believe this is a spiritual conversation, and this is a place where the church needs to lead the way in order to move our communities forward in how we steward God's resources. I'm your host, James Lenhoff, and I am so passionate about this conversation and helping leaders have the confidence to step into it. We believe that if we help people thrive financially and grow spiritually, it changes everything. And I am so excited to join you on this journey. This podcast is brought to you by Good Sense. If you'd like more information about what we're up to, you can go to our website at goodsensemovement.org. All right, let's get started with today's conversation. Well, today we're going to talk about being a prudent spender. Being a faithful steward involves being both a diligent earner and a prudent spender. We talked about diligent earning last week. Today we're going to talk about the other side of the equation. What we do with God's resources, we tend to spend them. That's where it goes. Now, spending in the traditional sense, we think of buying things and services and experiences, and spending is all about budgeting and controlling how the money goes out. But we actually want to take a bigger picture view of spending, that a prudent spender is a generous giver, a wise saver, and a cautious debtor, because those are all ways that we spend God's resources as well. It's not just that we're spending it to buy things. It's also that we are giving it away, we are saving it for future needs, and we're minimizing and monitoring our use of debt. Those are all really important aspects of a prudent spender. But we also need to zoom out even further and recognize that we're spending everything that God is asking us to manage. We're spending our time, we're spending our life, we're spending our experience, our talent, our skill. We are spending everything that He's given us on something. And so the question is, are we spending it well? Are we being intentional with how we're spending our time and our resources and our talents? Are we actually paying attention? Or are we just being inattentive, reckless, emotionally responding and spending without any thought? Those are really important to pay attention to. As we teach others to be prudent spenders, we need to zoom out and say, this applies to your entire life. All of what God has given you to manage, all of the resources that He has blessed you with that are His still, you need to honor Him with how you expend those, how you actually use those resources. And so when we talk about being a prudent spender, almost everybody would immediately go to, oh, we're talking about a budget, right? A budget is the answer. That's what we do when we talk about spending. We manage our spending through a budget. I hate the word budget, and this may feel like it is just nuance, but it is really important. The key to a budget, the goal is to spend as little as possible. So when you think about how people tend to approach budgets, it's restrictive, it's constricting themselves into a box they actually probably don't fit in very well, and they, over time, get exhausted by it, exasperated by it, and they stop following it. When we think about the traditional approach to spending, and when we go to conferences for Good Sense, we'll hand out yo-yos. And a lot of times people are like, what do yo-yos have to do with money? But the experience most people have with their finances feels a lot like a yo-yo diet, where they'll focus and they'll get really intentional and they'll buckle down and they'll restrict themselves and deny themselves for so long that they end up binging. In other words, they just say, forget it. I don't want to do this anymore. I deserve it. I've earned to buy this gadget or this experience or this thing that I want. And so they spend and splurge because of how restrictive and uncomfortable that budgeting process has been. Here's the way I always describe it. When I talked to clients, I would say, hey, budgets are always made for the wrong reasons at the wrong time and with the wrong numbers. But other than that, they're great, right? The problem with budgets is they're made at the wrong time. We decide we're going to buckle down and we're going to figure all this stuff out because of the wrong reason. We want to buy this thing that we're not 100% sure we can afford, but if we do a budget, if we really focus, if we get it all mapped out, then we can convince ourselves that we can buy that thing that we've already decided we're buying, by the way. And they're all done with the wrong numbers. So they're done at the wrong time, for the wrong reason, and with the wrong numbers. I'll have a conversation with somebody where I'll ask the question, hey, what do you spend on groceries? And they say, we could probably spend $300 a month on groceries if we tried really hard. And I tell them, okay, first of all, you're out of your mind. You have 3 kids. You're going to be spending more than $300 a month on groceries. And second, that's not the question I asked. I didn't ask, what could you spend? I asked, what do you spend? And they don't know. Most of the time, people say, if we only spend this much on this, and if we only spend this much on eating out, if we only spend this much on clothes and gas and utilities, then we can afford this new car, or then we can afford that next bigger house or this vacation that we want to take. And so we end up in this cycle of convincing ourselves, if we just were to live in this box that we cannot fit in, then we'll be able to do all these things we want to do. But that box is based on made up numbers. That budget is completely fabricated. It's a pipe dream. The reason why you can't fit in it is because you could never touch those numbers. You just made them up out of thin air. And so if that's how budgets typically work, it's no wonder that they typically fail. A lot of times we'll see people talk about budgets as the solution to overspending. We need to stop overspending. We need to get out of this cycle of spending more than we make. But the problem there, a lot of times, is not because you don't understand where the money is going, although that's certainly part of it. The bigger driving factor for why we see overspending is because we are medicating emotion. This is why this is the church's jam. This is where we belong. We should be speaking into this conversation. When I see people who are building up credit card debt, they're struggling to make ends meet, they're spending right up to the limit of their income, it's mostly because they're trying to buy something. They feel inadequate. They feel insignificant. They feel like a failure, and they don't like that. It's uncomfortable. And so they want to feel better, and they feel better by spending money on things that the marketing messages have told them will make them feel better. If you feel inadequate, just drive this car. It'll help. If you feel insignificant, just have this gadget or this hot new clothing item that everybody needs and that shows that you're something and that you matter. We're buying significance and status and comfort and pleasure in order to medicate these negative emotions. The problem is that is a spiritual issue. That is a heart condition. It's not a math problem. None of these problems that we talk about in money actually boil down to math. I've never seen anyone spending beyond their means, outspending their income, getting into credit card debt and creating huge financial issues because they can't do arithmetic. These aren't math issues. They're not math problems. They're emotional problems. We are taught by the marketing agencies that when we buy these things, we'll feel better. And that's why we're overspending. And so a budget doesn't solve that problem. A budget just highlights it, just puts it in our face over and over again, just makes us constantly feel guilty, makes us feel like a failure, maybe makes us feel inadequate. And guess what we do when we feel that way? We go spend money. They become this frustrating backwards cycle that's constantly putting us in the same position. And we use the solution that got us there in the first place to try to solve the problem. And this is the cycle we're trying to break. When we think about being faithful stewards, we want to first acknowledge, most importantly, we will spend God's resources. In fact, He expects us to. That's why He gave them to us. He expects us to use what He gave us to manage, and those things can be for our enjoyment. They can certainly be for our delight. In fact, there's lots of references in the Old Testament, lots of scenes where God is frustrated with the Israelites because they didn't party. They didn't have fun. They didn't celebrate. They didn't do relationship and engage in shared enjoyment. God wants us to have an enjoyable life, but, and this is a big but, it is really important when we acknowledge that all of these resources are His. A faithful steward will always be able to tell the master what they did with his resources and why. And so it is incredibly important that we track our spending, that we know where it's going. That's not just our financial spending, by the way. That is all of our spending. How are we spending our time? Is that honoring him? Is that what he wants us to do? Are we spending it in exhaustion and in chasing things? Or are we spending it in deep relationship and intentionality, right? All of these things need to be focused on where we are saying back to the King of the universe, I have spent your resources well. I know where it went, and I know why I chose what I chose. It was intentional. It was thoughtful. It wasn't just spur of the moment and emotional. It's so critical that we see all of these resources as his, so that we are called to honor him with them. So how do we solve this problem? Well, a lot of us, when we think of the overspending fear, we're afraid that we may get out over our skis, spend beyond, and so we either do the budget and give ourselves this deep restriction, and we get to the end of the month and we didn't have any fun this month. High five. We spent no money on entertainment, no money on eating out. We were absolutely miserable, but we didn't spend much money, so that's what we're going to celebrate. What I want to argue is that response is an overcorrection, and it actually leads to that yo-yo problem where eventually we just decide arbitrarily, because we've restricted ourselves for so long, we deserve the big thing, the next big spending. We deserve to splurge a little bit. And that's really exacerbated by the fact that that's what most of the marketing messages out there for products are. Most of the messages are, you deserve this. You've earned it. You deserve a break today. You deserve to have this gadget. You've earned the right to spend your money on these things. Doggone it, you deserve it. And so when we mix the marketing message that's reinforcing this idea that we've restricted ourselves for too long, you get that binge and purge kind of cycle. In a lot of households, we see this guilt around spending. A lot of times we see couples come together, and the way I always describe it is there's a go and a woe. The go is the person who says, we're fine. We can spend the money. Let's go. Let's do the things. Let's have the fun. Let's buy all the stuff. And then the woe says, we're not fine. We're in trouble. We need to buckle down. We need to focus. We need to really pay attention to our spending. We need to spend as little as possible. We're in trouble. And the problem is neither of them know who's right. The go says we're fine, but they don't know if that's true. And the woe says we're not fine, but they don't actually know if that's true either. They might be okay, but there's no reference point. There's no agreed upon plan. There's no intentionality for how we're going to approach life. And so if there's a tendency towards guilt and shame and conflict around spending money, it can become this really difficult relational paradigm that just breaks down connection, breaks down intimacy and delight with each other, because we're constantly fighting over whether we can or can't spend that money. And so what we like to recommend is prudent spenders have a spending plan. We want to approach spending with an intentionality and a knowledge we will be spending money. We will buy things. We will buy experiences. We are going to use God's resources in this way. It's a given. We know it's going to happen. The question is, do we know where it's going, and do we know why? And that basically is the two-part approach to this process. A prudent spender is tracking. A prudent spender has a method to track what God's resources are doing, where they're going, what's happening with them, so that there is an awareness of what life costs. What do you spend on groceries? What do you spend on your car insurance? What do you spend on these different pieces? We need to track those things so that we have a really clear understanding that the life I'm living costs this much. Before we start changing anything, before we start restricting or making up numbers in a budget and saying we'll spend only this much, before we do anything to change any of our reality, we first need to understand our reality, and that starts with tracking. Now, by the way, we have a spending tracker that you can download, a spreadsheet that we use as a starting point. If you don't have another way to do this, you can click into the show notes and get that document and start tracking and categorizing your spending if that's something you haven't done before. But we also recommend automation here. To whatever degree you can use technology to automate this process, whether that's using Quicken or Simplify or Mint or all these different products that are out there that are built to download your transactions and automatically categorize them and clean up that process. Because the truth is, anything you're doing that is involving you inputting the data, if you get a week or a month or 2 months behind, the hill you have to climb to get caught back up in your tracking is so high that you just give up on it. And so we need to systematize and simplify that process to the degree that we can. Technology is awesome for that. So start with the spending tracker if you don't have another idea or don't have another option. But we highly recommend using software programs that are built to track spending, to categorize it, to understand before you change anything. Just understand what you're doing today. Once you have tracked your spending for a while, 90 days, 6 months, once you have a really good handle on what it takes to make your life work, what you're spending on these different categories in reality, not what you wish you were spending, but what you actually are spending, now we can start to develop a spending plan. A spending plan is what ultimately is the solution to the problem that the budget typically creates. One, it's based on real data. We're using actual numbers. This is what we do spend on groceries. Now, we can decide after we've understood it that we want to try to change that somehow, but we also realize that we're going to be spending something pretty close to this unless there's some drastic change. We know what we spend in these different categories, and we know that's going to happen. I see all the time this conversation from gurus that say, well, if you just stop buying coffee at Starbucks, you'll be fine. I've actually not met anyone who their spending problem is as small as a few dollars here and there for coffee. More often than not, it's bigger rocks that they don't even see, they don't understand because they've never tracked it. They don't really know where the master's resources are going. And so they don't have a reference point for what should change. They just start changing things and thinking that's going to fix the problem, but they never understood the problem in the first place. So once we've tracked it, then we can start to move to really being intentional. And we decide ahead of time, this is the life we're going to lead. We're going to spend this much in this category, this much in this category. We're going to spend this much on vacations every year. We're going to spend this much on utilities, this much on fun, eating out, movies, whatever the case may be, whatever it is that you love, build it in to your plan. But when we build that spending plan, it's rooted in the idea that we will be spending. So when we get to the end of the month, if there's an entire category that we said we were going to spend because that was the life we were going to live and we didn't do it, we're not high-fiving over that. We're not celebrating the fact that we had no fun. We didn't do any of the entertainment that we said we were going to do. We didn't see a single movie, even though that's something we're passionate about. Right? Whatever those things are for your family, if you've built them into the spending plan, spend the money in those categories. Do what you said you're going to do. We don't want to celebrate restriction and denial of the things we know we want and the things that we know would bring us closer together and have great experiences. We're not going to celebrate the fact that we didn't get closer, that we didn't have those experiences, because we know what's going to happen. Eventually, we're going to binge. We're going to absolutely go crazy and buy a bunch of different stuff and overspend in response to that long restriction. And so we need to be really intentional about saying, this is what we're going to spend. This is why. This is what it's buying us. It's buying us connection and depth of relationship. It's buying us the things that matter to us. And then if something that we want doesn't fit in the spending plan because we've already spent all the money, we have two options. Either we earn more or we recognize that some of this has to go. We have to downsize. We have to get a smaller house. We have to, maybe sell one of our cars. We have to make a decision that would actually make it available to us to have this other thing that we want. These are mutually exclusive decisions. You can't have, these are not both and. You can't say, I want this and this and this and this. These are what we call non-negotiables. If I pick this up, I have to put this other thing down. They are mutually exclusive. And those consequences of picking this up are the things we never work through. The spending plan allows us to do that. We work through the consequence of, if I say yes to this thing, I have to say no to these three things. Are we okay with that? Have we all decided that that is what we want? Because those consequences are real. Most of what I see when people have been overspending and accumulating debt and struggling in their finances, they haven't wrestled to the ground the consequences of what they say yes to. They aren't saying no to the things that would require. And then they wonder why it's not working. When you have developed your spending plan with a lot of detail and you know this is the life we want to live, now you have a couple of really amazing things that open up for you. The first is that if we've decided ahead of time, this is what our life costs, this is what we're choosing, then we can have the power to say no to more. The lure of more is this constant pull to experience more and more pleasure, more and more of what is different and what is new to us. And the problem with that constant lure of more is that it pulls us along without a whole lot of awareness of where we're spending the master's money and why, and where we're spending the master's time and why. We're just emotionally reacting to our desire for more. But if we have established a spending plan where we know this is contentment, this is enough, this is what we choose, then when the lure of more comes along and says, hey, you'd be happier if you had more of this, or this would make you happier, we can say, no, I've decided ahead of time. This is what happiness looks like. This is contentment. I've chosen it. I don't need any more. And when we've chosen that, when we've drawn the line in the sand, what we call the lifestyle cap, where we say this is what we're choosing, then when more earning comes in than what we need for that lifestyle cap, we don't spend it. We don't emotionally react with, I got a little extra money. It's burning a hole in my pocket. Let me go spend it. We've already decided we will be spending intentionally on these things, and we will enjoy our life at that level. Anything that comes in above that then sets us up to be a generous giver. It sets us up to set aside that abundance and be ready to be obedient when God says, give my resources to that person or that cause, or make that problem go away, or fix that issue for that family. We say yes. It's an incredible change. The margin that we constantly tell ourselves we don't have enough of in order to be generous suddenly shows up everywhere because we've stopped letting our lifestyle chase our income. So the bottom line when we talk about this idea of being a prudent spender is God is expecting us to spend his resources. It's all his, but he is giving it to us for a purpose, and part of that purpose is our life experience, our human experience. There is an expectation for spending. Spending is not evil. It's not something that you need to feel guilty about. But we do need to be able to go back to the master and say, I know what I did with your resources. I know where they went, and I know why I chose that. I was not manipulated and easily taken advantage of because I was intentional with the decisions I was making. I walked into each month with a clear plan for what I was going to do with the resources you gave me. That is what a faithful steward says back to the owner of these resources. It's not bad to spend. It is really bad to spend recklessly, emotionally, to be making decisions that are more about medicating your discomfort than they are about honoring the king. It is really bad for us to step into a month with no idea what our life costs and expect that on the other side of that month, we're going to have clarity and we're going to have made good decisions. These things all feed on each other. And I talk to people all the time that say, we don't need to track anything because we spend well below our means and we're fine. My argument back to them is I still would say that's not faithful stewardship. If the master were to come along at any point and ask you, what did you do with my resources? If you say, I don't know, we just didn't spend it all. I'm not sure that's enough. I think it is reasonable for us to have the expectation of accountability and the call for intentionality here. And I think it is reasonable for us to tell the people that we're leading in our church communities that this is what it looks like to be a faithful steward. A faithful steward is prudent in their spending decisions, intentional with how they're using God's resources, because they see all of those resources as God's, and we want to make sure we're honoring him in those decisions. All of these things boil back down to intentionality and thoughtfulness, and those are core tenets to being a faithful steward. Well, thank you so much for listening to the Faithful Steward podcast. Be sure to check out the show notes for links and other information that we mentioned in today's episode. Also, be sure to check out our website at goodsensemovement.org to get all the resources we offer churches to help equip them in teaching financial stewardship to their community. If you have any questions or any topics you want to make sure we cover on our show, you can email me at jameslenhoff@goodsensemovement.org. I'd love to hear from you. I hope you all have a great week. We'll talk to you next week.